Today we'll be looking at Unit 18 of your grammar book. It is about conditionals. We will be looking at conditionals type 0, type 1, and type 2, each of them representing a different kind of probability, meaning how likely it is for the results to take place once the condition has been fulfilled. When we are looking at the structures, you will realize that it involves a lot of tenses. Therefore, instead of trying to memorize everything and confuse yourself, it is more helpful if you try to understand why these tenses are chosen to construct these sentences. Let's start. Type 0 is used to describe things that are always true, like scientific facts. If you look at the sample sentence here, it says, if you press the switch, the light comes on. Regardless of time, this will always stay true. Whenever you press a switch, the light comes on. We can relate it to the present simple tense, which is what we use to describe habits and facts that always stay true regardless of time. Therefore, for the type 0 conditional, we use the present simple for the condition and the present simple for the result as well. Next, for type 1 conditional, we use it to talk about things that are real. We use it to talk about expected outcomes. If you look at the sample sentence here, it says, if we do not deal with the global warming problem, temperatures will rise. Whenever you choose not to deal with the global warming problem, the next thing that happens is temperatures will rise. Therefore, the condition is not affected by time. But whenever you do that action, the next thing in the future will be the result. In this case, we can relate the condition that is not limited by time to the present simple tense and the result that happens in the future with the future tense. Therefore, we use the present simple tense for the condition and the simple future tense for the results. Now, if you remember, the word will is not our only choice when using the future tense. It is the same case here. We can also use going to when describing the result of a condition. It's just slightly less formal. Or, in another case, if you want to describe an action that should be done after a condition has been fulfilled, you can use imperatives to give orders. Like in the sample here, if you don't know a word, look it up in a dictionary, which means if you don't know a word, what you should do next is to look it up in the dictionary. It is an order or a suggestion for you. Now at the bottom of your page, you see 3 phrases that seem irrelevant to conditional sentences because you do not see the word if. In fact, these 3 are alternatives, are different ways for us to write conditional sentences. But of course, each of them means something different. For the word unless, we use it to talk about a condition that shouldn't happen. We need this condition to not happen in order for the result to take place. The next one, provided or as long as, is the opposite. We use them to talk about a condition that definitely has to happen in order for the result to take place. And the last one, in case, is when we talk about a special situation that is possible and we want to be prepared for, and it also fulfills a condition. So all of these are still about conditional sentences. It's only different ways to write it in order to present different meanings. Next, let's talk about the type 2 conditional. It is used to talk about unreal conditions, which means imaginary things. Look at the sample sentence here. It says, if you were on Venus, you would see the sun rise in the west. The fact is, you are not on Venus, and therefore you are not seeing the sun rise in the west. It is all imagination, just like a story. And when we write stories, we usually write them in the past tense. This may help you understand why we use the past tense to describe the condition, and we use the past tense of the word will to describe the results. Notice here, although we are using the past tense, we are not saying this is something that really happened, but we are using it to describe something that is unreal. Something special about the conditional to is the phrase, if I were you. We usually use it to give advice because when we tell people to do things, it could seem a little bit impolite. But we could tell it like a story and say, oh, I wouldn't do that if I were you. Which means if we swapped identities and I became you in my imagination, I would not do the same things that you're doing. In this way, we're giving advice to a friend. Now, after looking at the different conditional sentences, it could be confusing to try and figure out what we mean by real conditions and unreal conditions. The fact is, it depends on the situation of the speaker and what he or she is trying to say. In the end, we are all just trying to express ourselves with language. Let's look at these two situations. In situation A, I think that a friend is going to lift some tables. So I tell him, if you try to lift those tables on your own, you will hurt yourself. Which means, I think you are going to do it, so I say, if you do this action, the very possible result is you will hurt yourself. Situation B, I see some tables, but no one's doing anything. I simply make a comment because I imagine those tables look heavy. So I imagine if anyone tried to lift them, they would get hurt. No one is trying to lift them, but the whole lifting is all in my imagination and is therefore unreal. So you can see the so-called real or unreal, it's really depending on you, on what you are trying to say, because you are the one using the language and you are the one making meaning. Now we'll be checking your answers on pages 71 to 73. I will have very brief comments on some of the questions, so each slide may not be long enough for you to check all the answers. Feel free to pause the video to check your answers and mark them with a red pen. For this part, you can see that all the sentences are describing scientific facts, which means whenever the condition is fulfilled, the result will definitely happen. Therefore, they are all written in the present simple tense, or we can call it the zero conditional. For this part, we are naming different solutions to environmental problems. So for each of the solutions, we are taking an action and we expect a change to come afterwards. So we name the condition in the present tense and the expected results in the future tense, also known as the first conditional. This part requires a little bit of previous knowledge about the world. For example, in question 3b, you have to know that the Earth is going round, and now you are asked to write a question that asks the opposite. You are suggesting something that is different from reality. That is a hypothesis, or we can call it an imaginary situation. So we use the past tense and would to describe it, also known as the second conditional. For part 4a, you are required to choose between the expressions unless or as long as, which are opposites to each other, as we've discussed before. Therefore, you have to check the meaning of the sentences carefully before you write. For part 4b, it is more straightforward because you don't have to choose between different expressions. You only have to pay attention to getting the form correct. This part is slightly more complicated because you have to choose between the different conditional sentences in order to fill in the blanks. Remember, type 0 describes things that are always true, type 1 describes things that are real, and type 2 describes things that are unreal or imaginary. Let's look at the answers. Question A. You are imagining how a new writing method will work. Therefore, imagination type 2. B. You imagine yourself as a horse and see from its perspective. Imagination type 2. Question C. You are describing the results of a scientific experiment. The results are likely but not definite because there are some unexpected moments in science as well. Therefore, type 1, not type 0. D. You're imagining beetles not being eaten and therefore the situation will be different from reality. Imagination type 2. E. It's a likely result of how our body will react, type 1. F. We can't look inside our own eye, so it's an imagination of something quite unlikely, type 2. G. It's a definite scientific result of how things happen, type 0. Finally, imagine removing all salt from the ocean. It's not something that can happen. It's only an imagination. Therefore, type 2. Write down any corrections you have to make and we'll discuss more in class.